And welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program with the upcoming UK general election. British voters will go to the polls. Prime Minister Boris Johnson hopes his Conservative Party wins a majority so that he can push ahead and deliver Brexit. But the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, said it's time for, quote, real change, and he's offering a very different vision for Britain. 3.5 years after the UK sent itself into Brexit-induced political paralysis, will the 2019 general election help break the deadlock? Before we get down to our discussion with our guests from Europe and from China, take a look at this first.
It's the final week before Britons cast their votes for the next leader of the UK. Polls show that the Conservative Party is leading the election.
Here it is, I believe.
Incumbent Prime Minister Boris Johnson has promised to pass his Brexit deal and bring a budget within 100 days if he is re-elected. The Tory leader says it would include his pledge to raise the national insurance threshold, along with funds for schools and the NHS. Tax cuts are also on the Tories' agenda. His major opponent, Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, has focused on education. Labour is promising to cap class sizes at 30 pupils across all schools in the UK and recruit nearly 20,000 extra teachers over 5 years. The Liberal Democrats have a similar campaign pledge, but the major issue remains to be Brexit. This election may seal the divorce between the UK and the EU. Pending for nearly 3.5 years, Brexit has tested quite a few British politicians. It has also put a lot of other issues on the back burner. Mr Johnson said a new trade agreement with the EU could be reached by the end of next year, calling it a very exciting prospect. But critics say there is not enough time to negotiate such a deal, and it could lead to the UK leaving the EU without an agreement at the end of 2020.
For the upcoming UK general election in Durham, we have Tom Brooks, a professor of the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University. In Brussels, Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center in Brussels. And in our Beijing studio, Liu Mingli, deputy director of the Institute of European Studies at the Chinese Institute of Contemporary International Relations. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Brooks, now, how much do you think Mr. Johnson is going to have a winning possibility?
I think he's got a lot of challenges. So on the face of it, he looks very good. He's very much up in the polls. It's been holding fairly steady, but he's in a similar position in many ways that Theresa May was in before, and we saw the polls narrow quite sharply right before the general election. I think you'll see more of that. And also, having a very big lead for one side has proven to be a bad thing. It softens support for candidates for whom there's already soft support. So Brexit was never supposed to win. Trump was never supposed to win. I think Johnson's lead could be his undoing.
That's coming from the UK, the analysis, Professor Brooks. What about you, Mr. Cameron, from Brussels? Who is likely to be the winner? Mr. Johnson, once again?
Well, Brussels thinks he probably will win, but they really want someone to get a grip on the Parliament and make sure that there is some sort of deal. The EU has been dealing with Brexit for 3 years. They want finality to it. They want to move on, do other things, and they want a government capable to act in the UK. That's the real requirement.
The newly elected chair of the EU Council have been suggesting if after the election the EU will be in full spirit to discuss furthermore in negotiation with the UK. And Mr. Liu, how much do you see what's going to happen after the election is going to have an impact on the result of the election in the UK?
I think it depends on the result of the general election on 12th of December. If the Boris Johnson has a majority in the House of Commons, they have an overwhelming majority of the seat, I think there is a high possibility that the the deal between Boris Johnson government and the EU will be delivered maybe before the end of January. If John Johnson, yes, he wins, but there is not a majority in the Parliament, that will be very challenging for both UK and the Europe and Brussels.
Yeah.
I think first of all, it will be a question what kind of government will be formed after the election. Even George Johnson, if he doesn't have the majority, it will be very complicated for the negotiating between the Labourers and the Democrats
right.
and other parties.
Professor Brooks, what do you think are the deciding factor at this moment for whatever the result could be of the election?
Well, I don't think that Brexit will necessarily be the big thing for the elections in the UK. I think that it's big for people, certainly those of us who follow the politics very closely. I think for most of the country, as was I think true in 2017 at our last general election, the big issue for a lot of people right now has been about austerity and public services in particular. And that is why we see all the parties, Labour, Tories, the Liberal Democrats and others, all making big pledges on healthcare and police and transport, some making bigger promises than others, and each offering many different options. But that, for most people on the street, is really the main issue. Brexit is a problem, and people talk about it, and they worry a bit about it. But in terms of the detail, that's not something that most people know about. They just know that some people think Brexit will be great, and others think it won't be.
Right. Will that be the dividing factor, Mr. Cameron? Once again, from Brussels' perspective.
Well, it will be an important factor, but it plays to different parts of the electorate. The problem is that this silly slogan that Boris Johnson is using, we'll get Brexit done, is meaningless, because even if Britain were to leave technically in January, there'd be years and years of negotiations on all kinds of issues. So Britain's relationship with the EU will be dogged by interminable negotiations for the foreseeable future.
But you know, Mr. Cameron, some of the political slogans are always work that way. It's not supposed to tell the truth. It's supposed just to give people a mirage, isn't it, Mr. Cameron? You know politics very well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I mean, it can come back to haunt you, this. If you promise something and you can't deliver it, there might be problems down the road.
Well, they will have different ways of saying that, well, they have already delivered it. After the election, if the result is somewhat manageable, would that mean there's likely to be free trade negotiations? Would that mean there's likely to be important emphasis on so-called integrity of the market, on fair debate and competition, and also on so-called Good Friday Agreement? Will that be delivered, do you think, whoever will be the head of the UK government?
The advantage of Boris Johnson being Prime Minister is that he can do a 180-degree turn without the blinking an eye. So he's very flexible, shall we say. And the idea that you can do a full trade agreement with the EU in a year is nonsense. There's absolutely nobody in Brussels who believes that. It will take several years, probably. So the question is, to what extent will Britain seek to align itself with the single market during this period, or will it seek to diverge? Because this is obviously what some people on the right wing of the Conservative Party want to do, get away from what they call the intrusive regulations from Brussels. But the more the Brits diverge from Brussels, the more difficult it will be, and the longer it will take to actually sign a free trade deal.
Only a few years, that seems to be what Mr. Cameron is suggesting, quote unquote, but rather not 1 year or within the year. Professor Brooks, agree?
I completely agree. I completely agree. I think it's the government, the British government, had a 2-year timetable to agree a withdrawal agreement and start the transition. And instead of 2 years, just to agree the terms of withdrawing, let alone a deal, it's taking more than 3 years, and it might take even longer if Johnson isn't able to get an agreement through, should he be victorious, or for Jeremy Corbyn or others if they even decide not to withdraw after all. So they weren't able to make the timetable a longer timetable to agree just leaving, let alone what they would be leaving to do. I think that the likelihood of it taking less time to do the more complicated project of a trade deal is frankly implausible.
Yeah.
And it's particularly implausible given that the government has not figured out not just what it wants out of withdrawal, but has made no view on the 18,000 or more EU laws that it will have to revise or keep or end until it knows what it wants out of negotiations, and it can't get to that next step.
You know, Brexit is only one thing, particularly the trade negotiations after the election. But there are other things, Mr. Liu, that are going on in the world. The UK certainly wants to become still an important player, whether a Brexit or not, certainly after this general election. So one of the things is what's going on between China and the United States. Now, the new, once again, chair of the European Council already suggests there could be a Cold War, quote unquote, in his words, between China and the US for the long term. And he said the EU does not want to be a nobody if that really happened. Now, the UK earlier as a significant player and certainly one of the 5 members of the Security Council, permanent members of the Security Council, aspires always to play a big role. So what would that mean for the UK, the overall changes going on around it in the world?
I think, first of all, UK is an open economy. I think UK is also a supporter of free trade. So the international economic environment is very important for UK's economy. For example, I think this year, particularly after the second quarter, UK has so clearly signs of slowing down for its economy.
Right.
So it's UK is very concerned about the international economic situation. In the European continent, the United States and China, that are all UK's major economic partners, particularly the Eurozone. Eurozone is the #1 trade partner of the UK, but since this year, Eurozone also shows clear sign of slowing down. To my observation, the major reason is that the protectionism policy and the slowdown of the world economy in both Asia and the United States. I think UK is concerned about the economic situation in Eurozone, the United States, and in China.
How much do you think the complicated situation in the world is likely to drive or, to a certain extent, define the agenda of whoever will be the Prime Minister besides the Brexit?
I think that Brexit is a very big problem for the UK in many reasons, and one of them has been that it has brought almost to a complete stop any type of domestic legislative agenda. But it's also completely distracted the country and its leadership from being leaders in the world. And I think one of the medium to long-term problems of the Brexit discussions now, whether or not Brexit happens, has been Britain not being at the table and looking like it doesn't have an interest in international affairs that it most definitely has a strong interest in. So there's much happening in the world, climate change discussions, other important issues, migration, and so on. I think that Britain had a better voice as part of the European Union, so I think it's been a mistake for Britain to be contemplating leaving the EU. But I think it's much worse than that, because it just doesn't have the space or the time or even much of the interest in being part of wider global challenges given its own domestic problems.
Mr. Cameron, what's your observation? Will the UK be able to be active once again after the general election and later making the decision about Brexit or not, or in what way to do the Brexit, with the rest of the world in a way? Would they still function as much as it used to be, Mr. Cameron? What would this election mean on those issues?
Well, in a word, no. I mean, it's losing the combined power of 500 million people, whether you're speaking on a foreign policy issue or a trade issue. So it'll be much more difficult for the EU to operate. And a lot of people are including Johnson, putting some faith in the relationship with the US. But Trump is very unpopular in Britain, because one of the big issues in the election is whether the Brits will be doing a deal, free trade deal with America involving their cherished National Health Service, which is what the Americans want, but which the Brits don't want. So I think it's going to be very difficult for the Brits post-Brexit to punch the same weight they have been punching as being part of the European Union.
Yeah, but you know, Mr. Cameron, when you think about it, after the drama for the earlier 2 years regarding Brexit or not, or in what way, and then who will be the Prime Minister, what about the general election for the political parties, do you think voters in the UK will be more sophisticated than they used to be? Or people have a very short attention and memory spans? Everything happened before likely to come back again, Mr. Cameron?
No, I mean, the big parties who used to take about 80% of the votes, I mean, that's no longer happening. You've got the rise of the Liberal Democrats, you've got the Brexit Party, which won't do as well this time as they did in the European elections. You've got other fringe parties, including the Greens, you've got the SNP in Scotland. So the Parliament will be, again, more divided, and it could well end up that there's no majority. Now, are the voters more sophisticated? We'll see. If, for example, there are some seats where either the Labour or the Lib Dem, who both are Remain supporters, are up against the Conservative, whether there will be tactical voting, where they will move their votes to the one who has the best chance of defeating the Conservative. That would be really sophisticated, but I'm not sure to what extent it will actually happen.
Things are becoming ever more complicated, Professor Brooks, even for the UK. Now, the UK over the years, well, it's trying to seek Brexit and trying to figure out a way to do it. It's also trying to diversify its trade relationship and its political interactions with the rest of the world. How do you see the success of those efforts so far or not? For example, how would that be able to make the next administration, whoever will be the Prime Minister, be more multilateral than just function within the EU? Help me more about that, Professor Brooks.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Britain will have a very difficult time. So it's part of a very big kind of multilateral, multinational group in the European Union. It's very much acting alone in wanting to go. And I think that Britain's big problem from the start is not really knowing much about where it wanted to be, other than it didn't want it to be a painful process and it wanted to be in a similar, if not stronger, position. It hasn't really thought through what the consequences of leaving the European Union are. I think that's also become abundantly clear. So one of the things that's in the background is it will have to find new allies to supplement the trade and also the close ties beyond trade that it's had with the European Union if it's to make a success of Brexit. One has been looking towards the United States, which I think has been a mistake, not just because of the unpopularity of the American president in Britain, but I think also because you have an American president who's very protectionist and wants to not do deals with other countries that he thinks might benefit them more than the United States. So I think he's not the person to be doing a deal with. He's not looking for that. I think that Britain has done some things looking about China, which I think has been excellent. So kind of looking at Huawei and the 5G network, I think, was a step in that direction. The London-Shanghai Index is another step in that direction, though it's something I think they haven't thought as much about beyond that. I think that they need to be doing more of that, and then looking what that kind of trade relations could mean for other types of cooperation between those countries. I think those would be the things that Britain ought to be thinking about, ought to be asking itself, and isn't yet.
Right. Mr. Liu, of course, uncertainty is the word that we have to embrace every day so far, but nobody wants extra amount of uncertainty. Now, the UK, whether to have Brexit or not, will be carrying that burden. What is going to be its future? So would China, in a way, like to deal with the UK when everything is not yet settled?
China is observing the general election as well as it did during the past 3 years. For this election, I think China is less concerned than the European partners. because I think personally I don't see a lot of Chinese enterprises who invest in UK and export their products to the European continent. So for the general election, I think the key point is that what kind of Brexit we will see after the election, what kind of bilateral relations between UK and the European Union will be in the future.
I see. Mr. Cameron, now we see if the new Prime Minister emerge in the UK as a result of general election, it is coinciding with the new leadership of the EU coming into the office at some of the most important positions. So what would that mean? A brand new relationship, or likely to be a continuation of the earlier nature of relationship?
It'll be a continuation. I mean, the chief negotiator for Brexit was Michel Barnier. He will continue to do that job for the trade negotiations with the EU. Some of the commissioners who were involved before are still in the current commission, like Franz Timmermans and Margrethe Vestager in important positions. Phil Hogan will be the trade commissioner. He knows the UK very well. So there'll be a great deal of continuity in terms of the relationship that has gone on before and going forward into the future.
Finally, before we go, I want you gentlemen to shed some light on the final result. Johnson or not, and what's likely after election? One sentence or two. Let's go from Professor Brooks. Have to be short and sharp. Professor Brooks, go ahead.
Okay, I think it will be probably a coalition led by Labour.
Okay, and the future?
Brexit Party will split with the Tories.
I see. Mr. Cameron?
Well, I hope that's right, but I fear it will be Johnson with a small majority, and the problems will continue with the EU for the foreseeable future.
Wow. Mr. Liu, last but not least.
I think Conservative will be the number one party still, but I don't see an end of the Brexit process.
I think that's safe to say, right? Liu Ming Li, Fraser Cameron, and Tom Brooks, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, gentlemen.